Muy buenas tardes a todas y a todos. Voy a cambiar al inglés por beneficio del invitado. Um, Thank you very much, everyone, for attending to this invitation. Thank you very much to Chief Vega for all the support. Also to my great companion, my great support, Roxana Rosas, which chairs the line of investigation, México, Nación, Estado y Comunidad. Uh, this is also an event that happens inside the line of research. I have the great pleasure of introducing to you to Professor Andy Lamey. Did I say that correctly? Okay. Andy Lamey is a Canadian philosopher. He also works as a researcher in the University of California in San Diego. And he is author of the book, The Global Refugee Crisis and What to Do About It. And he's going to talk to us about uh, immigration justice in territorial lands that pertain to indigenous peoples. Obviously, the talk has another title that Professor Lamey is gonna say. But before giving the microphone to Professor Lamey, I just want to stress the importance of this kind of activities. I'm going to switch in Spanish to that. Las filósofas, los filósofos, las personas teóricas no tenemos laboratorios, entonces es muy importante este tipo de ejercicios de trabajo en progreso, ¿no? Es mediante el trabajo en progreso que podemos ver nuestro trabajo en otras personas y recibir críticas. Entonces, por favor, siéntanse libres de preguntar, criticar, hacer cualquier tipo de objeción al trabajo del profesor Lamey. Adelante, por favor, siéntense por acá. Cualquier crítica objetiva, generosa es bienvenida. No se necesita un doctorado o una maestría para hacer una buena crítica. Lo que se necesita son buenas intuiciones y ánimo de discutir eh, cuestiones, problemas teóricos, ¿no? Entonces, well, thank you very much, Professor Lamey, for coming to this event. Please, go on.
Last week. I'm very impressed by the border station and what's happening here. I'm honored to be here. Thank you for coming. And I have to say, I extend my special gratitude to you, Enrique, for making this possible. Thank you very much. So Enrique has told me that I should plan to talk to you now for about 15 or 20 minutes, perhaps. I gave a longer version of this talk this morning, so I have more slides I'm going to show you. I'll show you a couple. Okay. But if I had to kind of try to begin with a big picture kind of summary of what I'm trying to do, I think I'm really trying to sort of do two related things here. And so as a political philosopher, I'm really, I think, trying to make the case for this moral idea that I call in the paper enforcement and exceptionalism. I'm trying to make the case for the idea that insofar as international borders run through the territories of the indigenous people that I'm concerned with, there is a case rooted in justice for not controlling their entry with the same policies that other people have to go through. So an exceptionalism motivated by the desire to facilitate and ease their passage across those borders. Okay, so that's sort of the normative, the moral / political idea I want to defend. And then, of course, I do say I think that entails what I call a legal right of free passage. And you may have noticed I'm a little bit vague about some of the precise details on purpose, because I don't think as a political philosopher I can articulate a one-size-fits-all legal right that could be plopped into every country's immigration law system. If we get to the point where we're debating, okay, how would we make country A's process implement exceptionalism there. If we get to that point, then my work is done. Okay. I do talk about the one version of this idea in the American context, what it might look like. Okay. So so those are the kind of the two big ideas: enforcement exceptionalism and a legal right of free passage, deliberately acknowledging that the final form of that right is going to be subject to some variation based on how different countries do things. One of my assumptions is what I call border realism. So I proceed from the assumption that states do implement borders with entry policies. I am try to be explicit that I am not assuming that those policies or the fact that they do that is just or fair. And so for that reason, somebody who was an open borders advocate, even though I don't challenge discretionary border control in a larger way, even an open borders advocate, or even for that matter, an anarchist could agree with what I'm saying today in my mind, because I'm not trying to make a statement about ideal immigration justice. I'm just trying to say that compared to the status quo, this principle and the corresponding right would be more just. Whether that takes us to the ultimate final, ideal realm of justice, I'm officially agnostic on that. Okay. And I've got these three rationales, and I'll say a little bit more about that. Okay. So I won't show you every slide that I have, but maybe I can show you just a couple. Okay. So I think you'll recognize the region of the world depicted in the upper left. And so those colored areas indicate the historic homelands of 7 indigenous nations whose homelands are divided by that border. So here we are, the historic homeland of the Kumeyaay people, all the way over to the part of the Texas-Mexico border where the Kickapoo people have long lived. Up in the right-hand side there, that yellow bit, so this is New York State. And above it, the green and the red correspond to two different provinces inside Canada. And so that is the home of what in North America are often called the Iroquois people, who now use their own name, the Haudenosaunee. And so that their territory is divided not only by the US-Canada border, but also by those internal provincial borders, but those borders aren't policed. And then I have the example of the Torres Strait in between Australia and Papua New Guinea, historic homeland of the Torres Strait Islanders. And there's Sapmi, the historic homeland of the Sami people, which straddles what is today Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia. Okay, so I could go on, right? But you get the idea, right? Like, it's not uncommon for these borders to exist and to have been drawn in a way that do not take into account the interests or concerns of the indigenous communities who were long resident there. So there's been a lot of work done on theories of justice as they pertain to migration. And there's been a lot of work done on what the specific rights might be that are appropriate for indigenous people, but less work on where those two come together. Okay, enter me. Okay, so I'm calling them border people. I say that we should apply the principle of exceptionalism that I talk about in the paper. It entails this legal right of free passage. And that right is going to be subject to some kind of variation, as I say. One of the components, I think, that will be present in most implementations of this right is this idea that when a member of one of those communities shows up at that border, the requirements of the kind of identification that they should be obliged to show should be relaxed. In particular, they should not have to go through the normal requirement of showing either a passport or a visa. As I say in the paper, it could take a lot of time and energy to get those, but they should be allowed to pass through just showing identification that confirms their status as a member of that indigenous nation. I think that version of the idea of the legal right of free passage, I think that one's gonna be pretty common. There'll be more variation. So like when I go back to the US, I have not only my passport, but like my Sentry card. Okay. And as you probably know, like it makes a difference, right? Okay. So like in the American context, maybe this idea of exceptionalism entailing some kind of legal right of free passage, maybe in that case, for the people on that border, maybe that would entitle them to like free cards of this kind. Okay. I'm not really married to that particular detail, but hopefully you get the idea, right? But I can't, but there's countries that don't have these. So like, that's one reason there's going to be variation. And I'll say just something super briefly about the existing policies that are currently already in place. So I think the border that comes closest to what I'm advocating would be the border between Canada and the United States, because that border is subject to the so-called Jay Treaty, which the United States and Britain signed over 200 years ago. And so there's a clause from that treaty that basically says that that border will not be a controlled border. It should allow the free passage of what they called back then the Indians. Okay. So what that means is if you're a native person in Canada and you show up at that border, you don't need to show your passport. You don't need to show your any kind of visa. You can just show what in Canada we call your status card that shows you're an Indigenous person, and that's enough. And once you arrive in the US, you're allowed to remain indefinitely. You're automatically entitled to work here, to study here, to stay forever. You're automatically entitled to a green card. So I've read accounts on the internet of people who've arrived in the US that way. They'll do that and they'll get their green card in 6 weeks. If you're familiar with the American immigration system, you know that's very unusual, right? So there's something like what I'm saying there, but along with some differences, okay? So it shares with what I'm talking about, this idea of not having to show documents that are immigration specific, but you can use these other documents that Indigenous people are likely to have anyway. So they'd have to go through the process of getting special documents. My first two rationales, they emphasize the role of culture as their justification. And so I have to kind of attach certain conditions to that would have to be met in order for somebody to stay indefinitely. But there is a path to permanent residency to staying indefinitely in my proposal. That's in this existing policy. Okay, so there's some overlap. There's also some very big differences, though. So I'm just talking about those groups I call border people, whose territories are intersected by those borders. But the Jay Treaty, that applies to every native person in Canada. So imagine somebody born in the Arctic, an Inuit person. Their historic homeland could not be further away from the border with the US, right? But they're entitled to all that. So in that way, it's much more expansive than what I'm talking about. And I can talk about why I'm not quite saying the same thing, but that's an important difference. What I'm talking about ideally would be something that applies regardless of the direction of travel. So would it apply to somebody going into the US from Canada or vice versa? That's not already there in reality, because the Canadian view is, oh, the Jay Treaty was canceled by the War of 1812. So it has no force in Canadian law, but it still has force in American law. As I was saying in the earlier talk today, you may never know how much as a Canadian I appreciate an anecdote where the Canadians are the bad guys and the Americans are the softies. We don't get that very often. But there's this blood quantum requirement in the Jay Treaty. And so you have to demonstrate that you are not only Indigenous, but that either at least one of your parents or two of your grandparents were. And my proposal does not require any kind of blood quantum. Okay, so there's one example of how something like it is in place. There's something a little bit like it up in the Bering Strait, where Indigenous people can travel back and forth between Russia and Alaska without having to get a visa. But there are very tight restrictions on the purposes of travel. It has to be to see family. I don't have that tight restriction. And then even on the border that we can literally see from here, right? As I don't need to explain to people in this room, its history is a very militarized, controlled border. But even this border has a moment in its history where there was a kind of legal exceptionalism. And that involved the Kickapoo people, who for a long time have migrated back and forth between Mexico and Texas. And in the 80s, they were subject to a special legal program that allowed them to cross without having to show immigration papers. Okay? Beyond the US, something a little bit like that Bering Strait arrangement with a bit more latitude in terms of the purposes of travel, that exists in the Torres Strait. And then finally, in Scandinavia, I mean, they've had their own treaties, but really there's been no meaningful border control in Scandinavia since the introduction of the Nordic Passport Union. So there's no processes of enforcement that require any kind of exception, right? The Russian border is a different story. I mean, it's a very, very tight border. So what I take from all that is there, I like to think that gives me like a little bit of support, right? Like we know that the world will not end if any kind of exceptionalism is implemented, and we know that the communities in question care about it. But I don't take the mere fact that like there's like pieces of what I'm saying already in effect. I don't think that supplies with the full justification. And so hence the heart of my paper, where I try to show that there are these three frameworks that do lend separate independent lines of support. The Hayekian argument rooted in a conception of culture as a spontaneous order, the difference liberal conception of the state as being an entity that in order to be just must avoid unfair favoritism. And so it would, I argue, would justify this right as a kind of compensation for the inevitable cultural favoritism of even otherwise scrupulously liberal states. And then finally, this justification rooted in indigenous sovereignty, a little bit different from traditional conceptions of sovereignty that we encounter, for example, in international relations, but similarly to the more familiar conceptions of sovereignty, conceives of sovereignty as both a concept about control and legitimacy. And I say that my proposal, compared to current reality, is more in keeping with respecting these communities as sovereign in the sense as that idea is understood in indigenous sovereignty. Okay, so that's like my big picture overview. If people want to ask me questions, I would love that.
Thank you very much, Andy. I selected one of the greatest minds of the generation to answer to Andy's paper. I'm going to introduce you Diego Amador Magaña, Dr. Diego Amador Magaña. He's a graduate from the PhD here at the station, and he's also the chief of Juridic Clinic Alay de FOPA of the Ibero, and he also does jiu-jitsu. What is the name of the activity? Okay, sorry. Uh, he's gonna take 5 minutes to answer to Andy's paper. Please, Dr. Amador.
I'm going to make first a little comment in Spanish and then I'm going to move on. Primero que nada, pues agradecer al profesor Juan Vega, a la doctora Roxana, a ti mismo, al profesor Andy Lamey, que podamos estar aquí. First of all, thanks to Professor Vega, Professor Roxana, Professor Enrique, and Professor Lamey to make this possible and to choose me to make this comments. My comments are very short. A little doubts that the paper strikes me, and like 4 topics. First of all, I think it's quite a big challenge to reconciliate the non-ideal theory with the ideal theory that you propose in your methodological approach. It's wonderful to do that. When we do ethics of immigration, we as philosophers tends to do ideal theory or non-ideal theory, but I think it's the first time I see someone who tries to reconcile both methodologies and propose something quite different. Points that I kept my doubts are in this order. First, in your first page, Professor Andy, you defend or you propose the idea of this legal right to free passage. And you base this right in this idea that indigenous people were over here right before the line was drawn, the border line was drawn. So I think the base is like a territorial right. I think what we're defending here is the base of this right is territorial rights. And then you move from territorial rights to cultural rights and so on. And here's my first doubt with the paper. So if we're defending a legal right to free passage. My first question is how we understand legal rights. Are we extending legal rights from a naturalist point of view, like legal rights are morality based, or we are understanding through your methodology that this legal right is based on some kind of legal positivism, like, I don't know, hard, uh, inclusive or soft positivism. I don't know how you defend this, how do you understand legal rights? But if we are defending, if my interpretation is right, a territorial right based, I don't know how cultural rights or we can claim culture can give me a territorial right. If this is so, I think citizens can claim also a cultural right and a territorial right through your argument. This is my first doubt. My second doubt is over the cultural argument. You point out, Professor, when you were explaining Hayek, Rawls, Twerking, this idea of cultural rights and the cultural values of minorities. And I remember for the text you use Professor Wilkin Lika arguments, but there's also the argument of Professor David Miller that says that, well, cultural rights, we can stand on from 2 points of view. First point of view is the national culture that we can call that like public culture. That's what Michael Balzer said, that we have a history in common, a same language, same ideology, and so on. And then there are private culture. If my question is in that point, how can we understand culture if in some cases the distinction between my culture as a private self, it's quite different from the public one, but it is what happened with indigenous people. Sometimes, for example, here in Mexico, it's quite different. The branch between this public culture and the private culture. So that's one of my points. I think there's a line drawn between what's public and private. And if we're basing this cultural rights, my question is what happens with people in Tijuana and San Diego? We basically share the same culture in some points. Why we don't have this legal passage right? So I think that that point of the cultural right makes me this kind of doubts. The third point is with your concept of sovereignty, and you use when you defend the indigenous sovereignty as a concept, and you draw on the idea of sovereignty, the Westphalian sovereignty, and I feel very uncomfortable with this idea. First of all, because in legal theory, when we talk about indigenous people rights, we don't think in their sovereignty. We think in their self-determination, right? Eh, But that's a point apart. What I'm uncomfortable with the concept is that I feel when we create concept, and there was a concept before like sovereignty, and then Westphalia sovereignty, indigenous sovereignty, what happens is what Professor Ernesto Laclaus calls floating concepts. In Spanish, is concepto flotante. And I'm going to draw an example of what this is mean. For example, if I'll say democracy, well, the concept of democracy is going to depend of who you're asking to. And I think the same happened with your concept of sovereignty. Well, it's going to depend who you're asking what is sovereignty. If you ask indigenous people, they have a concept. If you go to international relationships theory, they have a concept. So why don't you just create a robust concept of sovereignty that can englobe everyone, including self-determination rights of indigenous people, rather than create a specific concept? And final, this is a practical question that it draws me about this wonderful paper, is that here in Mexico, our Supreme Court make a precedent about indigenous rights. What the court says or establish is that if I, as a Mexican, as a human being, go and say I'm indigenous people, I deserve without question indigenous rights, without question. It's a fundamental right, a constitutional right, only because the court says that if I self-perceive as indigenous, I can claim that kind of rights. What happened with people here in Tijuana that go with the Kumai people, and Kumai people says, no, you're not part of a membership. You can claim you are part of the Kumai. But the law says again, how can we reconcile this point if the law, the legal right, at the end of the day said, I can do it. Nobody can claim me wrong for that. It's my human right, and in fact, it's my constitutional right. So I can claim no problem with that. But the indigenous people at the end of the day can claim me wrong for that because I'm technically saying I'm indigenous when I'm not indigenous. So that's my, I think, 4 points that your paper strikes me. Again, it's a wonderful paper. I enjoy a lot reading you. Well, that's my 4 points that I think we can talk about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Amador.
Más fácil.
Before I open the floor for the next questions, do you want to answer to
Yeah, sure.
Diego?
So thank you for your careful reading. You're right that I think I'm doing something a little bit different from how other thinkers in the migration justice debate, how they distinguish ideal and non-ideal. So I know that you're familiar with Joseph Cairns, who's written a book. Half of it is, here's my ideal theory of immigration justice, open borders. But if you don't like that, I have all of these non-ideal proposals as well. So whereas I'm trying to say, this idea, I'm actually trying to be agnostic about whether I want to say that one person might say, hey, this is not my ideal. Say I'm an open borders person, but I'll take it at the non-ideal level, right? Whereas somebody else who's like much more committed to discretionary border control, they might think that discretionary border control is much closer to ideal immigration justice, and so accept it at that level. So I'm trying to make it as ecumenical as I possibly can. But I think you did pick up on that, right? So it's interesting to me that you mentioned territorial rights. So it's true that the people I'm talking about do have specific territories, as you saw there. But as you probably know, like territorial rights has come to have a certain meaning in the philosophical literature. And it's about like rights to particular territories based on your history in them and whatnot. And so I don't make any appeal, to my knowledge. I don't see myself as appealing to territorial rights. I think my first two rationales commit me to a theory that is rooted in the importance of culture rather than territory at the foundational level. It just so happens, though, that the people who share this culture, they have a certain territory. So it's through them that it has a territorial application rather than being rooted in a ground level commitment to territorial rights. Your question about like how I think about rights, on the natural law side versus positivism, I want to try to keep it as ecumenical as I can, right? So what I want is, so, when it comes to what the law actually should say, as of course despite their important philosophical differences, natural law theorists and positives often do agree, right? So it's in that spirit I want to put this forward. I'll let that debate just kind of play out. So in that way, I don't think I have a unique challenge here. And it seems to me the most secure laws often are supported by diverse frameworks in legal, political, moral philosophy. So again, I just want to like be ecumenical. You're right that not everybody is excited about cultural rights. You mentioned David Miller, right? So, but I guess like, you know, so it would be a problem for me if there was no framework out there whatsoever that could justify this, right? But I'm not really married to any of the frameworks individually, if you know what I mean. Um, so the reason I chose these ones is, so the difference liberals, Kimlicka, Patton, I mean, this just seems, I think it's like, if you accept everything they're saying, what they're saying, then this just like kind of follows from it almost automatically in my mind, right? So the reason I chose the Hayekian one is there's just this little quote, it goes by pretty quickly. There's a lot of people who are very critical and skeptical of indigenous rights and minority rights. Not all of them, but like Hayekians are very well represented among that group, right? So what I want to say is, hey, even if you can get all the way to Hayekianism, there's still this further leg of the debate because I think I can show inside Hayekianism some kind of case for this proposal. Okay, so then you come along, or Miller comes along, right, and says, well, wait a minute, maybe we don't even care about culture to begin with. Okay, but that's just a little bit different, right? So that's kind of saying like, so at that point, then I get to talk back to Miller, right? And I can say, okay, well, let's just have a normal, jolly, vigorous philosophical discussion. You give me your arguments, right? But until they're on the table, there's not really a lot I can say about them, right? And then cultural rights, blah, blah, blah. And then if I understand your last one, so maybe, please correct me if I'm misunderstanding you, but like, hey, maybe there's some kind of commitment to self-determination. That will be the concept that we apply to the situation of, say, indigenous people here in Baja or Mexico more broadly. But what if we go and do that, and then some potential members of that, of the Kumeyaay people, like they get like, they're not accepted or something, right? But maybe you and I think, no, if anybody's Kumeyaay, these people are, but they're not being accepted. The group is exercising its self-determination in a exclusionary way. What would I say about that? Okay, yeah. I mean, so I mean, we face a version of that problem already when it comes to immigration, right? Like it's currently regarded as very ordinary for states to have some kind of control. But to say that is not to say that they can exercise that control however they want. The most obvious example would be like obviously racist immigration laws, right? And so on the one hand, there are many countries that say, look, we want to control who comes here in the name of self-determination. And in that way is common with the principle that you're drawing attention to. But to be committed to self-determination, I don't think it necessarily follows that like, so any possible way of upholding or exercising it is fine beyond criticism. I think the racist immigration law shows that there are many political communities today that say we are committed to some kind of self-determination, but it doesn't follow from that you know, we can implement it, you know, willy-nilly without any restriction, right? So I want to make something kind of like that kind of response, right? And if I got your 4 points, and then why get into all this indigenous sovereignty stuff? Why not have, yeah. So it's true. I'm kind of reacting to what's out there in the world already, right? So I feel like this would be a problem for me, right? Hey, I want to talk about a legal right of free passage, okay? But then some indigenous thinker puts up their hand and like, well, look, we don't care about your liberalisms. We're into indigenous sovereignty. So, you know, if the people for whom this is supposed to be entitlement, if our starting framework just has no place for it, what's the point, right? So I want to come back to that, okay? Now, it's a separate question. Is indigenous sovereignty perfectly fine to debate it, right? But I'm saying insofar as it's already out there, I feel like I at least got to show that I could work within it. Whether it's ultimately the right one, that's a separate discussion.
Thank you very much. I have several questions, but please, Chief Vega, no, you're ready. Go on.
So, thank you very much for your paper and your presentation. To continue with the idea of the cultural aspect that underpins your claim, I was wondering if you have thought about certain requirements that have to be met for that cultural aspect to be viable for this right of free passage. I know you don't want to specify certain legal requirements for certain legal systems, but is there something that you have thought about regarding the requirements on the cultural aspect? This is why I have this question, because when I read your paper, I'm not saying you defend this, but it gave me the idea that one important point for this argument is that people have the opportunity to go and visit other people in the other side of the border. And that seems perfect. But I think there are other aspects that can also justify the cultural aspect of going crossing the border that are not necessarily linked to visiting other people or relatives or other members of the tribe. Maybe they want to go to certain landscapes that was important for them regarding certain religious traditions and stuff like that. So I was wondering if there's something in that regard.
Great. Okay, so that's the requirement. Okay, so that's really interesting. So you're not the first person to ask me that. Okay, so like maybe, maybe there's some part of the landscape that has traditional spiritual meaning for a member of one of these groups. Why don't I say that should be sufficient, right? Forget about, like, maybe there's nobody there. Okay, so and I guess the reason I don't say that, I guess I want to say two things. So I feel like I'm at like I've got to work with the frameworks that I'm pulling from, right? So it's not clear to me that they can get there, okay? But beyond that, I'm not placing any obstacles in the way of that, right? So let's grant for the moment that that actually is a legitimate entitlement of justice, okay? Nothing that I say rules that out, right? I would just say it requires a further argument, okay? So maybe, right? Maybe I'm like one rung lower down on the idealism, non-ideal scale of justice, and that's one rung right up. And we need to make a slightly more ambitious argument, right? That's all. So I'm not ruling that out. That's all consistent with what I'm saying, right? But I want to say, even if that is a legitimate entitlement of justice, what I'm proposing still has value as far as it goes. If there's further claims of migration justice beyond that, I don't want to dispute them. But if I can get us to, B or C, you want to go to D or F or whatever, like, you know what I mean? Now, so then it's interesting though, just to kick around the idea substantively. Okay, so one possibility is maybe we do want to implement in the law the idea that a specific religious attachment to territory does generate some kind of legal privileges or what have you. Okay, I don't want to rule that out, but I got to say personally, sort of, this is outside of the context of my paper, makes me a little bit nervous. Why? Because there's so many political communities around the world where the idea that we have a religious tie to this landscape has involved enormous bloodshed. Okay, Israel, Palestine, Northern Ireland, the idea that the Protestants have a special, like they see themselves as a covenant people with a tie to the land. And then the Boers in South Africa, they also thought that they had a religious tie to the land. So once we open that door, right, we want to be principled and fair, right? And so like, so I'm reluctant in those kinds of cases to say, yep, the law's on your side, and I feel consistency might oblige me to say something similar. And I say might, right, because I haven't really looked into it that deeply. But just on the substance, that part does make me, I just want to hear, I want to know more about it and have answers to those concerns.
By the way, I didn't mention that if someone wants to pose her or his question in Spanish, we could translate or anything. Well, yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor, for visiting us, presenting your work, and taking the time to talk to us about these topics. You are Canadian, right?
Guilty.
Okay. So as a Canadian, what do you think about the comparison of the J Act, how it allowed all members of Canadian tribes to basically get an immigrant visa upon admission into the US, and how it still stands having the U.S. federal government being able to revoke that over 200 years ago, as it was revoked on the Canadian side, right?
Yeah, yeah.
What do you think that it's still standing? Is it still standing?
Still in effect in American law.
Okay. What do you think that comparing that to the Kickapoo situation
yeah.
between that part of Mexico and Texas, that it was just in effect for about 6 years,
Yeah.
and it was kind of I understood that it was approved by Congress,
Yes.
by the U.S. Congress, and it was made more because of economic reasons of how these indigenous communities from Mexico that also were present as a tribe in the state of Texas supported the Texas and the broader U.S. economy by just crossing to do work. So, what do you think from your culture, from the Canadian culture, not as an American as you are now with the whole privileges of U.S. citizenship? What do you think about the treatment from the U.S. government to that treaty, to the Kickapoo one,
Mm-hmm.
to the J one that's still in effect,
Mm-hmm.
to the and also that that perhaps didn't happen with the other tribes that are closer to us here in the west of Mexico, like
Okay, yeah.
for example the Imperial Valley, how it's also a very prosperous agricultural zone, and there's also a few prominent tribes that cross that border. So what do you think about why the U.S. might still allow Canadians? Is it a more affinity about their culture or level of development, or as you said, like about the comment you said before about how these immigration laws may have some racially motivated things inside. So
Okay,
yeah.
so if I understand your question, the part about the Jay Treaty, like, what do I think about the fact that the U.S. it still respects the treaty, but it has the power to say no, just as it said no in the Kickapoo case? Like, what do I think about the fact that the American government has that power? Is that part of what you're getting at?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So, like, as I mentioned, the Jay Treaty, right, that goes beyond what I'm talking about, right? I'm totally fine with that, okay? Like, I would, again, my proposal doesn't call that into question at all. This is on the just on the substance of what it says, right? And it's rooted in the fact that it's the product of a treaty, right? So it raises these issues. So what I want to say is this entitlement, this is not the result of a historic treaty. I want to say this just comes from justice, basically, okay? But then you ask the fair, if I understand the spirit of your question, kind of a real world question. Like, look, the government has this power. Tomorrow it could say, you know what, we're done with that, okay? So if this is an entitlement of justice, or if there is anything to be said in the name of justice for the Jay Treaty, right, it's true. The American government could snuff it out and, by my lights, commit an injustice tomorrow. So in that way, we face the similar dilemma of any entitlement of justice that we're tempted to say, this is so important, it rises to the level of a right. The government, it's like a fire in the old house in the 19th century that would keep you warm, right? When the fire stays in the fireplace, it's a good fire. When it gets out of the fireplace, it's a bad, dangerous power, right? Government power is like that, right? So the traditional answer is to have some kind of constitutional document, right? Some kind of limit on what the politicians can do in the heat of the moment. Okay. So ultimately, so check back in hundreds of years from now, the ultimate solution, I think, would be to some kind of constitutional protection so that judges could stop the politicians. That's a kind of a very boring, familiar answer, but that's how I would go on that one. On the Kickapoo stuff, you're right. Like, it was partially economic, right? It had some very kind of they were just in a very unique situation. And you're right, part of it was they had been so well integrated into the Texas economy. Okay, so that was the motive, right? So I don't think, it's not clear to me at all that act of the American Congress, partially it was kind of self-interested, right? But I'm okay with that, right? Because I think the outcome was reasonable, right? So it can be hard to get people to do the right thing especially if it requires any kind of sacrifice. There we had a nice alignment because their self-interest did support justice. But I guess I like to think that we can sometimes have some influence by making arguments rooted in justice. And so hence, here I am. Am I answering your question?
So what about, yes, thank you, Professor. But what about the rest of the other tribes? For example, here the director said about an important landmark, cultural
Yes.
landmark, and I know there's around the Sonora and Arizona part. There's a cultural landmark, a natural landmark, on from the Tohono O'odham people, and it's on the Arizona side. And when the fence was erected, that was hard to reach from the tribe members of the. Uh-huh. So I mean, like, what about what also, why was it so short? Why do you think it was so short, 6 years
Okay.
versus more than 200 years from like why that thing wasn't expanded from to the Mexican tribes to other tribes?
Okay. So if we think of the other 6 indigenous nations on the US-Mexico border, okay, it could be the case that maybe nothing like this proposal ever has any traction or reality, okay? But I still think it would have value, and it would have a value as a tool of judgment, right? It would be able to tell us that, that's the way it is, and it's unfair, and it's wrong, and it would help us get at the truth, okay? The truth can be terrible, as Nietzsche tells us, right? But in that way, it would do one of the traditional functions of a theory of justice. If I understand you, you're drawing attention to the idea of like, what if there's some kind of significance to the territory in some of these specific cases? So like I said a minute ago, that is a little bit of a controversial idea, but let's just grant for the moment that this is the way it is. Okay, so we all agree, let's say, that no, interacting with the religiously significant landscape, that's like a really fundamental requirement of justice. Okay, can my proposal get us there? No, it can't. Okay, does it make it harder to get there? No. Does it get us kind of close to that? Actually, it does, right? Because all my proposal needs is that one person on this side of the border, right? So if that was like the most important issue in the world, it's true, I don't get us all the way there, but I get us much closer to them being able to experience that landscape insofar as they do so with other people, okay? So I think it's more ambitious, and I say ambition is good, but I just want to say, as important as that may be, trying to get as far as I'm trying to get, I think that has its own value. And then you were saying, why was it so short? Okay, so I just think a lot of it has to do with the very unique situation of the Kickapoo people. Okay, so precisely because they were migrants, they never really fully integrated into either Mexico or the US. Like their kids wouldn't go to like settled schools, right? Also, their culture didn't really place a lot of emphasis, really any emphasis, on documenting births with paper, right? And so you get this very unusual situation where you have this group of people who are, I mean, they're in both countries like for 6 months of the year, basically, right? But it's like, well, what's your citizenship, right? And it's like, well, we don't have any documents, right? But there's a place for them in the economy on the American side. So that motive is what motivates it. And there was only, I think, 700 people involved. And so one of the other entitlements that that act did was it said, any of these people, you can get American citizenship if you want it. And so I think 500 of them got American citizenship, and I think 200 said, you know what, we're just going to formally take out Mexican citizenship. So at that point, their special ambiguity went away. Now the law is still on the books, right? So if there was a Kickapoo person out there who still they would have this special card, right? But their situation got resolved just like, we're going to regularize your citizenship. So I think that's why.
So is your skepticism to take this in the case of an important landmark on the other part of the border? Is it because of the religious aspect of the claim to a territory, or not necessarily? Because we can drop that as a religious claim to the territory. All the bloodshed you mentioned.
Okay.
And it's just a cultural aspect of those people that they sometimes go and cross the border because they want every 6 months. I don't know. It doesn't necessarily have to do with some kind of
Right.
religious claim
Yeah.
regarding that territory.
Okay. So I think at that point, right? So anybody, I think, could have that kind of motive then, right? So now, like, I just love being in Tijuana, right? So like now I'm entitled to something like this, right? Like other people, they just happen to like particular landscapes. I think at that point we are getting now much closer to some kind. If that's the generates. Go ahead. Right. Yes.
And it was important for their culture, the cultural aspect of that civilization and that indigenous people. Not only because they like to just go there and see, but there's more than that regarding not all the way to a religious aspect of claiming territory over that, but before the fence was lifted, they used to do this and X, Y, Z regarding their customs and their culture.
Okay, so if the idea is that the tie to the land, now understood in non-religious terms, generates some kind of entitlement of justice, okay? That might well be the case, but I think that is a more ambitious claim than I want to make. Because I think that opens the door to many, many, many different kinds of people now being subject to this entitlement. So like, here's an issue we're dealing with in San Diego. We have like these seawalls. They have rich people live on the coast, and we build the seawalls to stop the erosion. And now there's big fights between these rich people and the government. And they're like, look, we're not going to rebuild them. Eventually you have to move, right? And they will say things like, but we are especially attached to this particular piece of land, right? And if we take this idea in this case and apply it here, then I feel consistency obliges us to give it force elsewhere in the law. And I'm worried about the possible implications in that case, other cases I've looked into. The idea that sheer attachment to territory is normatively significant. I mean, there's parts of the world that I really care about, right? But whether we have a right to that is a really big claim. And while I don't rule it out, just speaking as somebody who happens to have a view on that outside of this argument, those are the reasons I'm a bit wary.
I have a curiosity down to this cultural rights debate. I remember a paper about racial and ethnicity and border controls. The whole claim of the argument is that maybe oppressed people or oppressed minority have a right to exclude, to protect their culture, their territory, and the whole stuff, without being racial or morally wrong. My question goes in that side. Let's suppose indigenous people in US claim that they don't want this legal right because they think they are oppressed and they want to defend their own autonomy, their own self-determination, and they want to exclude the same indigenous people, but in this side of the border.
Yeah.
My question goes, it's a curiosity. In your idea, in your theory, how can you respond to this claim in case, I don't know, someone tells, I think I have a right to exclude you, even though we're the same indigenous people, but the way the border works is you there, me here, and
so if I understand you, there's a kind of analogy to the international borders around indigenous communities outside.
I'm trying to drown the argument for immigration control.
Yeah.
And create an analogy to this.
Okay, great. Yeah. So Kim Lucca talks a lot about this.
Yeah.
Okay. So, and so what he wants to say, and I'm committed to kind of going with him because he's in my second framework. There is a case rooted in justice for some kind of exclusion of some people from, let's say, reserves in the US. Okay. Now it's not unlimited, right? But what he says is, insofar as there can be restrictions that can plausibly be understood as compensating for or making up for disadvantages that these communities experience because they are such small little minorities in this larger English-speaking community.
Yeah.
If there's a way of thinking of these exclusions as somehow enabling them to resist or preserve their culture, their self-determination, then they can be okay. Okay, but you have your example, like, if I understand you, you're like, well, what if the people being excluded are themselves members of, okay. So there have been cases like that, right? Like the Pueblo people, as you may know, there was like a Protestant religious revival on some of the reserves in like Arizona, like I think back in the 80s. And the people running the reserves were like, look, you have all this free housing because you're Pueblo, but if you're going to convert to Protestantism, forget it, right? We're going to kick you off the reserve, right? So we take that, I think that's sort of in this, maybe the spirit of what you're asking me to talk about, right? So I would say with Kimlicka that kind of exclusion cannot be justified.
Oh.
Why?
Okay.
Because again, it has to be justified by the idea that we are, roughly speaking, trying to protect them from these disadvantages that are generated by their specific minority status, right? So what Kimlicka says is, for example, there could be limits on who could run for an election in the leadership on a reserve. It's reasonable to exclude people who are not like me. I couldn't run, right? So he draws a distinction between what he calls external restrictions, where we can, now it doesn't mean we can do anything to non-Indigenous people, right? But we can deny them certain things, like the right to run for the reserve leadership, perhaps the right to buy property or certain kinds of property, stuff like that, okay? The right to live there, okay? And why? Well, you can tell a story of self-determination where insofar as the majority really is a member of the Pueblo, that's going to enhance, right? But now we take those same measures and we apply them to some Pueblo people. That justification just is totally implausible now, right? Because we are no longer engaging in the kind of exclusion that kind of compensates them. Now we're kind of like, we're using the policies against the people who are themselves disadvantaged. So I would say the distinction between external restrictions and internal ones.
So even though they claim they're oppressed minority and they have this right.
I'd want to be more specific than oppressed. You can be oppressed in lots of ways, right? So like if somebody said I'm oppressed by poverty, right? I agree, actually. I think somebody, right? But like, it's not clear to me that migration is a solution to that, right? So I want to be very specific about the disadvantages, the particular kinds of oppression we're talking about.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Andy, for your talk. I was wondering what we are not seeing when we are talking about indigenous migration. It is a problem of discrimination, inequality, or something else. Thank you.
So I think the particular problem I'm dealing with, I would say I think it is a problem both of discrimination and inequality. I think the discrimination begins when the people who drew those borders in the first place first drew them with no concern. And then, as I'm sure you know, it's one thing to draw a border, it's another thing to actually, send out people with guns, right? So I think like the Texas border, I think they didn't really start having border guards there until the 1920s, right? But at that point, they're completely, it's like those people don't even exist for them, right? I'd like to think things are a bit better now, but it does seem like there is a specific disadvantage. And even if the people running the American immigration system, even if in some alternate universe where none of them were consciously discriminatory, it seems to have a discriminatory effect. And so I do want to say there is a kind of discrimination there, a kind of disadvantage. And I do think it is not only an inequality, but an unjustified equality, right? It's kind of like there's all these cultural pressures. So as I say, like, think about the difference it makes what language a government uses to conduct its business, right? So the fact that they use Spanish here or English in the state, like if that's your language, then it's like it's now preserved in public life down through the generations. And if your language is not part of the public institutions, it's deeply marginalized, right? And so there, I don't think, so there's different ways you can respond to that, but I think it's an unfair inequality in their case that they are put in this position where the government, it just inevitably plays favorites. And so that is an unjustified equality, yes.
Thank you so much again, Professor Andy. My questions came from sociology, so I don't
Okay.
want to change the direction of the talking, but um, I have 3 points related to your text. Basically, the first one is when you are talking about free passage and with all your examples, I was wondering why you don't use the idea of diaspora as a political project beyond the borders, beyond the yes, beyond the administrative uh, limits. So the second one is, well, I agree with Diego. I completely agree because there is a tension, an interesting tension between culture to identify and biology, some kind of essentialism and constructivism culture. But in that way, I was wondering that the question is not who's Kickapoo. The question is who wants to be Kickapoo in that scenario, in that hypothetical scenario. So and I have a third. When I was reading your examples, I was thinking about the bereber I don't know if it's the same word in English, a Maasai in the border between Spain and Morocco. And that tension is pretty important because there is the global south and the global north, a tension that is correlated with the global south and global north as here. Is the same situation, and I think that we have more similarities with those kind of borders, north, and we have north, global south. So that was my impression. And finally, there is one example, and is the community Mascogos. I don't know if anyone know that community, but they are Afro-descendants that came to Mexico in, I don't know, maybe century 18, that they came from Georgia and they are Afro-descendants. They live in a community called El Nacimiento in Coahuila. So it's pretty interesting because we were talking about indigenous people, but there is another tension with Afro-descendants that came from Africa in the slavery process after came to Mexico, and there is an interesting transnationalism process, and that's it. Thank you.
Okay. So on the diaspora stuff, yeah, so what is a diaspora? So you maybe know better than me, but I think of it as like, it's the members of that group or that culture who are no longer at the center and they've kind of gone off somewhere like another country or something, right? So the immigrant diaspora, right? So why don't I talk about that? Well, Native people are sometimes uncomfortable with the idea. We don't have to agree with them, but it's just worth flagging. Like it can be controversial to say, we're just going to treat you like any other kind of minority group, right? And they'll want to say things like, well, if you think of immigrants, for example, right? Like, how did they get here? Well, they chose to, right? But we didn't do that. And so there's a view that says the history of how the groups came to occupy a minority status matters. And so my second framework is very sensitive to that idea. But I think I can kind of affirm something in the spirit of an analysis that uses the idea of a diaspora, okay? So I wouldn't want to say like the Kumeyaay, like what side is the diaspora in the Kumeyaay case, right? Is it like they're really from Mexico and the diaspora is in the US or vice versa? I don't really think that kind of catches their reality, right? So I guess partially I am reluctant to use it for that reason, but the diaspora concept teaches us, right, that we can have something important in common with people who are on the other side of frontiers, right? So the spirit of diaspora analysis, I feel like I'm sympathetic to, even if I don't want to pin the diaspora concept on any particular subgroup in these communities. You're right that there are essentialist theories of culture out there, and like you, I'm quite skeptical of them, right? But then the question is, is every theory of culture necessarily essentialist? So in my second framework, one of the thinkers in that tradition, the Patton guy, he's like, look, I really want to talk about culture understood in non-essentialist terms, really about shared, you mentioned sociology. So he thinks, you know, to share a culture is to share, to some degree, some amount of socialization. So if you and I share a culture, then we've undergone at least some socialization processes that are similar. Doesn't mean there's still lots of differences, right? And so that allows for a lot of variation, right? And so, and even if we don't like his theory, you know, we could maybe put it in another one. So all I need is like for culture to be a thing. And when I'm in Tijuana, I feel like culture is a thing because I don't speak Spanish. So your third one, maybe I'm not quite getting it. If I understood you, you used the example of like the Spanish-Moroccan border, and that's like a really hard frontier between North and South. Here, yeah, the fence on the African side, if that's, yeah. So, and we have something like that here, if I understood you. Yeah, yeah. Okay, so that's got to be right. Yes. Okay. So, but like, there's huge issues around those forms of border control. Okay. So if you ask me, as somebody who looks into these issues, like, what do I think about those? Right. I want to say, I think they're pretty terrible, actually. I think there's a lot of injustice, right? It's just that the reasons I would just give different reasons than the one animating this, right? Because I'm trying to deal with something very specific. A lot of that is economic, okay? Like people trying to escape like grinding poverty and whatnot, okay? So it's totally open. Like I agree, like there's many forms of immigration injustice out there. I think there's something to be said for specialization, right? Let's tackle them one at a time, use the precise tools. And then in that spirit, if I understood you, this idea of the community that came to Mexico from elsewhere, and now in a sense, like they're like an immigrant community, kind of like maintaining some kind of presence here in Mexico. They might well have their own demands of justice, but all I want to say is that justice often requires us to give equal concern to the interests of different people and different groups. But once we recognize what those interests are, they will often require us to do slightly different things. For example, like what does justice entail in the American case? It'd be like, you know, the Amish people and the Mennonites, and they want to just, right? So like they have their issues, right? But they're not the issues of like African Americans or immigrants or Native peoples, right? So I think there's lots of ways different groups can make claims of justice, including claims of justice that touch on immigration. But I think we'll do a better job if we just like address them separately rather than all at once.
So I have a question if no one else has a question. I think your paper is wonderfully crafted. I think you've been very careful in framing every part of it, and I really admire that. But I wonder if you could get along with it, because my worry is that I had the sensation that you cherry pick the claim that goes well with your concern, and to bring support to your idea of free passage and exceptionalism,
Yep.
enforcement exceptionalism. But I'm not sure that's that you could go with it. Let me put an example. Some people ask you like, well, something of the sort like, what's the nature of the wrong what borders do to these peoples? So a lot of people have the intuition that is a territorial sort of harm because these people have a territorial claim, and that claim has been violated in some way by Westphalian borders. And you said, no, 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 I don't care about territorial claims. I only care about cultural justice. No, but then you don't have like a substantive view of cultural justice that says, well, what borders do to people is a harm in cultural terms. So if you change the question to a more substantive one and ask, what justice requires from us, or what legitimacy requires from us when borders cross people that have been there before, then I'm not sure that you could easily handpick Hayek and Patton and
Okay.
one single view about indigenous sovereignty,
Right.
because you will need to say rather classical liberalism, not Hayek, but classical liberalism may have a view that maybe Hayek won't support, that maybe doesn't sit so comfortably with your claim, and also egalitarian liberals will have a view that wouldn't sit so easily with your claim, and so on.
Okay, great.
So I'm not sure that you could just handpick the
Right.
arguments as you do. Well, maybe you are too good framing and I'm just jealous, you know? But I don't know. I had the sensation that
Okay,
maybe.
tell me if I'm catching the spirit of your question. Like, hey, Andy, isn't it a little bit convenient for you that your first two theories, they both seem to have this like common concern with culture? Like, what an amazing coincidence for you, Andy. Like, but what if we took one out and say we put in like a territorial-based theory of justice? Are you going to be able to tell the same story? Andy, isn't a lot of the work being done here kind of happening off stage when you're choosing what frameworks to work with? Am I catching the spirit of your okay. Okay, good. Okay, so I guess I want to say sort of two things about that. So one is, in an earlier version of this paper that I'm actually thinking of going back to in some ways, one of my theory was not Hayek, it was Walzer's communitarianism. And without having a big exposition of Walzer's communitarianism, in its own way, it is a theory that affirms territorial rights. And he says at one point it would have been legitimate for Australia to like divide in half, right? So that immigrants would have their territorial rights, white Australians would have theirs, right? So like, so that if I do that, then I think I might be speaking to this concern. But I guess what I want to say is, imagine I do work with not just that, but even a more full-on theory of justice rooted in territorial rights, like, is it Margaret Moore or Anna Stills? Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay.
Maybe it's not territorial. What I mean is that you don't have a view about what is the harm that the borders did to these people.
I do have a view, right? I think my theories say that it is a harm rooted in the damage done to a culture understood as spontaneous order, as living under a state that does not take seriously its requirement to ensure that we have equal opportunities to pursue our purposes. That's a Hayekian one. I think the second rationale, it has a view that there's been a failure of equal recognition on the part of the state and a failure to uphold truly impartial justice. And it has the third one has its answer. Okay. So as I say, I don't want to suggest that all three of these frameworks could be affirmed simultaneously, because I don't think they do agree on everything. Okay. But sequentially, I think they do lend support. But suppose like I channel like Margaret Moore or some other, like, I think they call themselves occupancy theorists, right? Like I actually think it would be pretty easy to get from what they're talking about to my proposal, right? It's like, no, if these people do have, this comes back to your example, right? Okay, well then let them, expedite their passage so they can exercise their territorial rights, okay? So my official view is that I think that framework, if I were forced to deal with it, I think it would get to where I want to go, actually quite easily. Okay, so that's my official view, okay, as the author of this paper, okay? Now, as somebody who's read those works, okay, now taking off my hat as the author of this paper, we're just talking philosophy now, okay? I think their view is bad, okay? And that's because I think there are many disadvantages to affirming a commitment to the idea that your attachment to territory is so significant that you have a right to inhabit the particular territory that you are attached to. So I gave the example of rich people, right? It's like, no, I have a territorial right to live on this really expensive piece of land overlooking the ocean. And so that could require enormous resources to maintain my property. Whereas it seems to me more intuitive. I mean, it's a little bit controversial perhaps, but it's like, no, you might have to make a sacrifice. You might have to move rich people in the name of try to mitigate the effects of climate change, better redirect those resources elsewhere. Here's another example, a little bit similar. So in Newfoundland, in Canada, the fishing industry is gone. And so there are all these old fishing villages, okay? So they're out in the middle of nowhere. And the government has gone to people in those villages and it said, like, look, it's really expensive when you need to go to the hospital and stuff like that. We got to fly you into the big city. We want to give you a certain amount of money to relocate. We don't want there to be a community here anymore because the resources required to sustain it are overwhelming. We could be having like, you know, healthy births in the hospital. There's just so many other things we could do with the money, right? But if they're able to say, nope, I have a right to territory. This is just as important as whatever else you'll be doing with the money in the city and the schools and the hospitals. That also is going to be very, very difficult to do. And that's another reason I'm wary of the right to territory. I don't want to say it has no significance, but a right is not a small thing. Like it's wrong. It's wrong to like, you know, they want to build a freeway here. Oh, that's my right to territory. You know, you can't expropriate my house. Well, you know, sometimes we need to, right? So unofficially, I don't think these thinkers have good answers to these questions. Officially, maybe I'm wrong. Okay, fine, use a territorial rights framework, but I still think that's going to generate a legal right of free passage.
Okay, but how do you demonstrate that the right way to frame what borders do to these people is cultural rather than territorial or rather than administrative, or because as much as you frame the kind of harm or wrong, then I think that reflects to the kind of right that emerges from there.
I
So
have to agree.
what kind of right will we end up? Is it an immunity right? It is a protection and only an exception.
Yeah.
I think that is related with the kind of wrong. And I know that you believe that it's cultural, but how do you know that?
Well, it's not clear to me that I need to conclusively show that it is cultural rather than territorial. You know, maybe there's an alternate universe where I take up even more of your time and I have a fourth framework and it's the territorial one, right? And so it could be a wrong, to your point though, that could have ramifications for like what the actual entitlement is generated at the end of the day, right? But notwithstanding that possibility, I'm not committed to denying that there may be an injustice rooted in territorial rights, right? Because I don't say anything for or against that, right? But number one, somebody would need to show me, okay? And number two, even if as I was saying before, even if I can't get to the exact same entitlement that would be generated by a territorial rationale, if I think I can get us closer to that. So I think even a territorialist, they might be a bit disappointed, right? They'd be like, yeah, you know, you don't really go far enough for me, right? But surely I come closer to them than the status quo. If that's their conclusion, I'll take it.
Something about freedom or autonomy. I mean, there are so many concerns that I feel you are too fixated in the idea that the harm is cultural rather than anything else.
So, I mean, you know, so what's the solution? Like, should I have like a chapter before this chapter, right? And I was like, here are the principles of theory selection, right? I'm reluctant to do that. I think we just need to dive in and choose the frameworks. In my defense, I guess, like the Hayekian one, like a lot of the leading critics, influential people think that Hayek says, you know, nope, no indigenous rights. So I think that's a big deal, right? I have a principled reason to choose that one. The second one, the stuff like the difference liberal one, I mean, I think Kimlicka in particular is arguably one of the most influential political philosophers alive today, like at a policy level. Like lawmakers in so many countries have drawn on his ideas. That seems one, not the only reason, right? But the most effective way to give voice to this line of analysis, I think, would be to show like, no, there's no cultural injustice here at all, right? So insofar as there is a cultural injustice, I think that's all I need. And that's consistent with there possibly being further injustices cashed out in territorial terms.
Well, thank you very, maybe someone in the Zoom? Oh, sorry, it's in my phone. Of course, I cannot see. This is Michelle Alvarez. Hello, Michelle from UABC. Do you know Michelle? She says, congratulations and thank you for your time. As minorities are being targeted in the US, even more in some states, in lieu of the presidential interpretation of citizenship and the 14th Amendment and other constitutional issues. Is there a possibility that indigenous rights can be an exception to these changes? She asks.
Wow. Okay, again, so I'll just take off my hat as the official author of this paper. So, what's going on now is very disturbing. This is perhaps a little bit controversial, but it seems like there are powerful forces in American society who do not accept that many communities of color really belong in America. Okay. It's like they're outsiders, right? They're from, so we said terrible things about Mexico and Canada. You know what I mean? It's like there's the good Americans and everybody else is kind of bad, right? So Native Americans are really hard to fit that framework, right? No, they're not from somewhere else. They are just as American, if not more so, than anyone else. So the Native American population in the United States is very small, much smaller and less conspicuous than many other cultural communities. I think that's probably part of the reason that those forces, they just don't devote much time to them. But insofar as the xenophobia against communities rooted in immigration, those are going to, yeah, I'd like to think that those particular ways of demeaning people will have less force because they're not immigrants. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, the poverty rates on reserves. There's a few prominent political leaders now and stuff, but as a rule, that what you said I think is true.
Well, if there is no further questions, thank you very much to everyone in the Zoom. Thank you very much for the dream team of the station for all the support and help. And thank you that came here tonight to listen to Professor Lamey. We are so grateful for sharing your work with us tonight. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.